You think your problem is motivation. You think you just need more willpower. That's the lie you've been feeding yourself to stay comfortable. The truth: your willpower is weak because your life has no structure, no rules, no lines you refuse to cross. You wake up every day negotiating with yourself like a coward, and then you wonder why you lose. Let me make it simple. A man without boundaries is a man already defeated. You've been sold this soft idea that discipline comes from feeling ready. That's garbage. Discipline comes from non-negotiable lines, clear, brutal, unapologetic boundaries that don't bend when you're tired, emotional, or distracted. Without them, your brain starts speaking in tongues, confused, inconsistent, switching identities every 5 minutes. One moment you're the ambitious version of yourself, the next you're scrolling like a loser. That's not complexity. That's chaos. Speaking in tongues isn't some mystical nonsense. It's what happens when your internal language is fractured, when your actions don't match your standards, when your identity isn't locked in. A powerful man speaks one language: certainty. His thoughts, actions, and standards are aligned. But you're switching dialects depending on your mood. That's why you can't trust yourself. And if you can't trust yourself, you've already lost control. Let me break your illusion. Willpower is not supposed to carry you. It's a backup system, not the engine. Boundaries are the engine. When you decide, I don't do this, it's over. No debate, no inner discussion, no emotional voting system. Weak men rely on willpower because they're too scared to define who they are. Strong men eliminate the need for willpower by becoming a fixed identity. You don't need more motivation. You need a personality that doesn't tolerate weakness. You need rules so strict that your bad habits don't even get a seat at the table. Right now, you're trying to outfight your impulses daily. That's exhausting. That's why you break. A dominant man doesn't fight every day. He designs a system where losing isn't even an option. You say you want power, but you're living without boundaries. That's like wanting to build a fortress with no walls. Everything gets in. Distractions, weakness, excuses. You're exposed. And then you blame lack of willpower when the real issue is you've built nothing solid to protect your focus. Here's the uncomfortable truth you don't want to hear. You break your own promises because deep down you don't respect yourself. And you don't respect yourself because you've never drawn a line and enforced it like a man. Every time you say, just this once, you weaken your identity. Every exception is a crack. Eventually, the whole structure collapses. You've been lied to about willpower. You treat it like it's your greatest weapon, like if you just had more of it, everything would fall into place. That's a weak mindset. Willpower is not strength. It's a last resort. It's what you use when your system has already failed. If you're waking up every day, depending on willpower, to carry you through basic decisions, you're already operating from a losing position. Think about it. Every time you say, I'll push through, you're admitting there's something inside you that needs to be fought. That internal conflict is the real problem. Strong men don't build lives where they constantly battle themselves. They build lives where the battle doesn't even exist. There's no debate, no hesitation, no emotional negotiation. The decision was made long before the moment arrived. You've been approaching discipline like it's a daily war. And that's exactly why you're exhausted. You burn mental energy trying to resist things you should have already eliminated. You keep temptations within reach and then act surprised when you give in. That's not a lack of willpower. That's poor design. You don't fix weakness by fighting harder. You fix it by removing the conditions that allow it to exist. Look at how you operate. You leave doors open for failure. You say things like, just this once, or I'll control it next time. That's not control. That's delayed surrender. Every time you rely on willpower, you're putting yourself in a position where failure is an option. And if failure is an option, eventually you will take it. Not because you're broken, but because you never closed the door in the first place. High-level men don't trust willpower because they understand its limits. It fluctuates. It weakens under stress. It disappears when emotions spike. You can't build a powerful life on something that's unstable. Instead, they build rigid systems and clear boundaries that make certain actions non-negotiable. When something is non-negotiable, willpower becomes irrelevant. There is no decision to make, so there is no energy to waste. This is where most people fail to evolve. They stay trapped in this cycle of trying harder instead of thinking smarter. They wake up motivated, push through the day using willpower, slip at some point, feel guilt, and then promise to be stronger tomorrow. That loop never ends because the foundation is flawed. You don't escape that cycle by increasing effort. You escape it by eliminating the need for effort in the first place. Understand this clearly. Every time you depend on willpower, you're reinforcing a version of yourself that still needs convincing. That's not authority. That's instability. A man with real control doesn't need to convince himself to act right. He acts right because it's embedded into his identity. There's no friction because there's no alternative path he's willing to take. You're not supposed to feel like you're constantly fighting yourself. That's a sign you haven't decided who you are. Once that decision is made, behavior follows automatically. Your environment, your habits, your routines, everything aligns with that identity. And when that alignment is in place, willpower becomes almost irrelevant. Right now, you're overestimating effort and underestimating structure. You think the answer is to push harder when the real answer is to remove the need to push at all. Because the moment you rely less on willpower and more on systems, everything changes. Decisions become automatic. Discipline becomes consistent, and control stops being something you chase. It becomes something you naturally embody. Your life feels scattered because your rules mean nothing. You've built a system where everything is conditional, flexible, open to interpretation. You say you're disciplined, but your standards shift depending on your mood, your energy, or who's watching. That's not discipline. That's instability dressed up as effort. When your rules are weak, your outcomes will always be inconsistent. You've trained yourself to operate in gray areas. Sometimes it's okay, just for today. I'll fix it later. That language is the reason you keep losing control. Every exception you allow becomes a crack in your structure. And those cracks don't stay small, they spread. What starts as one compromise turns into a pattern, and before you realize it, your entire system collapses under the weight of your own inconsistency. Clarity is power, and you've avoided it because it forces accountability. When your rules are vague, you can always justify failure. You can always find a reason why this time doesn't count. But the moment you define something in absolute terms, you remove that escape. Now it's either done or not done. Now there's no room for excuses. Most people don't lack discipline. They lack the courage to create rules that expose their weakness. Look at the difference between I'll try to be consistent and I train every day at 6 a.m., no exceptions. One is a suggestion. The other is a command. One invites negotiation. The other shuts it down completely. The problem is you've been living your life based on suggestions, hoping your future self will magically become stronger. That version of you doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is the system you build right now. Weak rules create constant decision-making. You wake up and have to think about everything. Should I do this? Should I skip that? Is this okay today? That mental friction drains you. It slows you down. It creates hesitation. And hesitation is where failure lives. Strong rules eliminate that entirely. When something is clearly defined, there is no thought process. You act immediately because the decision was already made. You're also underestimating how much your environment shapes your behavior. If your rules are weak, your environment takes over. Distractions win. Comfort wins. Short-term pleasure wins. You don't rise to your intentions. You fall to your standards. And if your standards are flexible, you will always fall short. That's not bad luck. That's predictable. There's a reason high performers are obsessive about structure. They don't leave things open-ended. They don't rely on feelings. They create systems where the right action is the default. They remove unnecessary choices. They eliminate ambiguity. Because they understand something you don't. Every unclear rule is an invitation for failure. Right now, you're trying to control outcomes without controlling inputs. You want results, but you haven't locked in the behaviors required to get them. You're hoping things will align instead of forcing them to align. That's why your progress is inconsistent. That's why you keep starting over. Because every time pressure hits, your weak rules collapse. Strong men operate differently. They define their standards in a way that leaves no room for interpretation. They know exactly what is acceptable and what isn't. There is no middle ground, and because of that clarity, their actions become predictable, consistent, controlled. They don't waste time thinking about what to do. They already know. If you're serious about changing your life, you need to stop pretending that flexibility is a strength. It's not. It's the reason you're stuck. You need rules that are so clear, so direct, that breaking them feels unnatural. Until you build that level of structure, you'll keep drifting. Not because you lack potential, but because you've never given yourself a system strong enough to support it. You don't have an effort problem. You have an alignment problem. You say you have standards, but your behavior tells a different story. That gap between what you claim and what you do is where your power leaks. Every time your actions contradict your standards, you fracture your own mind. You create internal noise, hesitation, and doubt. That's why you feel inconsistent. It's not random, it's structural. Understand what's really happening. When you set a standard and then violate it, your brain registers you as unreliable, not to others, to yourself. And once that trust is broken, every future decision becomes heavier. You hesitate more. You question more. You need more motivation just to do basic things, because deep down, you know there's a version of you that doesn't follow through. That knowledge weakens everything. You've been trying to fix inconsistency by pushing harder, but that's the wrong direction. Effort doesn't solve misalignment. If anything, it amplifies it. You can push hard for a day, maybe a week, but if your identity isn't aligned with your actions, you'll snap back to your default. That's why you have cycles. High discipline, then collapse. Focus, then distraction. It's not lack of capability, it's lack of coherence. A dominant man operates on alignment. His thoughts, words, and actions move in the same direction. There's no internal contradiction. When he decides something, it's executed, not debated, not delayed. That level of alignment creates speed. It creates clarity. It creates a kind of mental silence where there's no second guessing. That's what control actually looks like. Right now, you're living in contradiction. You say you value discipline, but you tolerate laziness. You say you want success, but you entertain distractions. You say you're focused, but your actions are scattered. That contradiction is why you feel stuck. You're pulling in two directions at once, and then wondering why you're not moving forward. You need to understand that your identity is not what you say. It's what you repeat. Every action is a vote. Every decision is evidence. If your actions don't consistently reflect your standards, then those standards are meaningless. They're just ideas you like, not principles you live by. And ideas don't create power, execution does. The moment your standards and actions align, everything changes. Decision-making becomes automatic. You don't sit there arguing with yourself. You don't rely on motivation. You act because it's who you are. That's where real discipline comes from. Not forcing behavior, but expressing identity. When identity is solid, behavior follows without resistance. Most people avoid this because it requires brutal honesty. You have to admit that your current identity is weak, that your standards are not being enforced, that you've been tolerating behavior that contradicts who you claim to be. That's uncomfortable. But without that level of honesty, nothing changes. You can't build power on contradiction. You can't become consistent while living inconsistently. You can't expect control when your internal system is divided. Alignment is not optional. It's the foundation. Without it, everything else is temporary. You need to close the gap. Not gradually, not when you feel ready, immediately. What you say and what you do must become the same thing. No exceptions. No delays. Because the longer you allow that gap to exist, the weaker your identity becomes. And once your identity is weak, everything else falls apart. Every time you ask yourself, should I do this? You've already stepped into weakness. That question shouldn't exist if you've decided who you are. The moment you open that internal debate, you give your lower instincts a seat at the table. And understand this clearly. Your weaker side is persuasive, emotional, and patient. It doesn't need to win immediately. It just needs to delay you long enough to drain your focus. That's how you lose control without even noticing. You've trained yourself to negotiate with your own standards. You treat discipline like a discussion instead of a command. You weigh options, consider moods, factor in comfort, and then you wonder why your actions don't match your goals. You've built a system where everything is up for debate. And in that system, The easiest option will always win. Not because you're incapable, but because you've allowed hesitation to exist. Decisiveness is not just a trait, it's a structure. It's built on pre-made decisions that remove the need for thinking in the moment. High-level men don't sit around asking what they should do when the time comes. They already decided days, weeks, or even years before. When the moment arrives, they execute. That's why they look consistent. That's why they look controlled. It's not because they're stronger in the moment. It's because they eliminated the moment of choice entirely. Right now, you rely on how you feel in real time. That's the flaw. Feelings are unstable. They change based on sleep, stress, environment, and distractions. If your actions depend on something that's volatile, your results will always fluctuate. You might get it right when you feel good, but the moment pressure hits, you start asking questions. And those questions slow you down. They weaken your resolve. They open the door for excuses. The real danger of negotiation isn't just delay, it's erosion. Every time you hesitate, you send a signal to yourself that your standards are optional, that they can be reconsidered, that they don't hold authority. Over time, that pattern becomes your identity. You become someone who thinks about doing the right thing instead of someone who simply does it. That gap is where mediocrity lies. Look at how you operate during moments of resistance. You pause, you think, you try to justify a different action. That pause is everything. In that split second, you either reinforce discipline or you weaken it. Strong men don't give themselves that pause. They move immediately because there's nothing to consider. The action is already aligned with their identity. There's no alternative path worth entertaining. You've mistaken overthinking for intelligence. You believe analyzing your choices makes you more in control. In reality, it's doing the opposite. It's creating friction where there should be flow. It's slowing down actions that should be automatic. Control doesn't come from thinking more. It comes from deciding earlier. The earlier the decision, the less power your emotions have over it. You need to understand that every time you negotiate, you're practicing weakness. You're reinforcing a habit of hesitation. And habits don't stay isolated, they spread. The same hesitation that stops you from taking action in small moments will show up in bigger decisions. It becomes your default mode. And once hesitation becomes your default, you lose speed, you lose confidence, and you lose authority over your own life. The shift is simple but brutal. You stop asking. You start acting. You remove the option to reconsider. You operate from a place where your standards are final, not flexible. Because the moment you eliminate negotiation, everything tightens. Your actions become sharper. Your mind becomes quieter. And your execution becomes consistent, not because you're forcing it, but because you've removed every pathway that leads to hesitation. You keep telling yourself you need motivation, but that's just a convenient excuse to avoid facing the real issue. Motivation is temporary. It rises, it falls, and it disappears the moment things get uncomfortable. If your entire system depends on feeling inspired, then you've built your discipline on something that was never designed to last. That's not strategy, that's dependence. What you actually have is an identity problem. You haven't decided who you are in a way that forces your behavior to follow. You're still operating as someone who tries to be disciplined instead of someone who is disciplined. That difference is everything. When you're still in the trying phase, every action requires effort. Every decision feels heavy. You need reminders, motivation, and external pressure just to stay on track. That's not power. That's instability. Look at how you approach your goals. You wait for the right mood, the right energy, the right moment. You tell yourself, I'll start when I feel ready. That statement alone exposes the problem. You've made your identity conditional. You've tied your behavior to your emotions instead of anchoring it to a fixed standard. As long as that connection exists, you will always be inconsistent. Identity is not something you declare once and magically become. It's something you prove through repetition. Every action you take is a vote for the type of person you are. If your actions are inconsistent, your identity will be weak. And if your identity is weak, you will constantly fall back into old patterns, no matter how motivated you felt at the beginning. You've probably experienced this cycle already. You get fired up, you commit to change, you push hard for a few days, maybe even a few weeks. Then something shifts, your energy drops, distractions appear, and suddenly you're off track. You call it losing motivation, but what actually happened is your identity never changed. You were forcing behavior that didn't match who you truly were, and eventually, the real version of you took over again. A strong identity eliminates that problem completely. When something becomes part of who you are, it no longer requires motivation. You don't need to feel like doing it. You do it because not doing it would feel wrong. It becomes automatic, almost effortless. Not because it's easy, but because it's aligned. That alignment removes friction. It removes resistance. It removes the constant need to convince yourself. Right now, you're trying to build results without upgrading your identity. That's why everything feels temporary. You're stacking habits on top of a foundation that can't support them. You're expecting consistency from a version of yourself that hasn't been clearly defined. And until you define it in hard, non-negotiable terms, nothing will stick. You also need to understand that identity is shaped by standards, not intentions. You can intend to be disciplined all day, but if your standards allow exceptions, your identity will reflect that weakness. The moment you tolerate behavior that contradicts your goals, you reinforce a version of yourself that lacks control. Over time, that becomes your default. This is where most people fail. They want the benefits of a strong identity without the responsibility of enforcing it. They want to feel disciplined without actually living it. But identity doesn't respond to what you want. It responds to what you repeatedly do. And if your actions don't match your desired identity, then that identity is nothing more than a concept. You need to stop chasing motivation and start building a version of yourself that doesn't require it. That means defining exactly who you are, what you do, and what you don't tolerate. No flexibility, no emotional loopholes, because the moment your identity becomes clear and enforced, motivation becomes irrelevant, and consistency stops being something you fight for. It becomes something you naturally maintain. You don't lose control overnight. You lose it in small moments, quietly, repeatedly, every time you break a promise to yourself and pretend it didn't matter. That's how authority erodes. Not through failure, but through tolerated inconsistency. You've been ignoring that damage, acting like it resets every morning. It doesn't. Every broken promise is recorded. Every shortcut is remembered. And over time, you build a version of yourself that cannot be trusted. You want confidence, but confidence doesn't come from thinking positively or visualizing success. It comes from evidence. It comes from stacking proof that when you say something, you follow through. Right now, your internal record is weak. You've told yourself you'd wake up early and didn't. You said you'd stay focused and got distracted. You made commitments and quietly abandoned them. That pattern sends a clear message: your word has no weight. And once your word has no weight, everything becomes harder. You hesitate more because you don't trust your own decisions. You rely on external pressure because internal authority is missing. You start looking for accountability from others because you can't hold yourself accountable. That's the real cost of broken promises. It strips you of independence. Most people underestimate how quickly self-respect deteriorates. They think it's built through big achievements, but it's not. It's built through small, consistent acts of integrity. Doing what you said you would do, even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching. That's where identity is reinforced. That's where authority is earned. Right now, you've been treating your commitments like suggestions. You give yourself options. You allow delays. You create excuses that sound reasonable in the moment. But every time you do that, you weaken your own position. You make it easier to break the next promise. You normalize inconsistency. And eventually, it becomes your default behavior. You can't build power on a foundation of broken agreements. It doesn't matter how big your goals are or how strong your intentions feel. If you don't trust yourself to execute basic commitments, none of it holds. You'll always doubt yourself at critical moments. You'll always question whether you can follow through. And that doubt will limit everything you try to build. The shift starts with understanding that your word is not negotiable. When you say something, it must carry the same weight as an external obligation. You wouldn't casually ignore a commitment that has real consequences, yet you ignore your own without hesitation. That's the gap. That's the problem. You treat yourself as optional. You need to reverse that completely. Every promise becomes a contract. Every commitment becomes final. Not based on how you feel in the moment, but based on the standard you've set. And if you fail, you don't brush it off. You recognize it as a breach of your own authority. That level of seriousness is what rebuilds respect. It won't feel natural at first because you've trained yourself to be inconsistent. You've built habits around flexibility and comfort. But the moment you start enforcing your word, things begin to shift. You start seeing yourself differently, not because of what you say, but because of what you consistently do. Over time, that consistency compounds. Small wins stack, trust builds, and eventually you reach a point where your word becomes absolute. You say something once and it gets done. No hesitation, no resistance. That's real control. That's real authority. And it only comes from one place, becoming a man who treats his own promises as unbreakable. So fix it. Define who you are in brutal, simple terms. What you do. What you don't do. No gray areas. No flexibility for weakness. You either live inside those boundaries or you accept that you're average. There is no middle ground, because at the end of the day, willpower isn't what builds powerful men. Boundaries do. Identity does. Control does. And if you don't lock those in, you will keep failing, not because life is hard, but because you're still negotiating with a version of yourself that deserves to lose. Decide who you are. Draw the line. And then become the kind of man who would rather die than cross it.